My name is Vivienne Hale, and I'm 36 years old. 6 weeks after my father died, I found a pill bottle in my own medicine cabinet, prescribed to me by a doctor I had never met, for a medication I had never taken, dated 11 days before I'd ever set foot in his office. I didn't call anyone. I didn't panic, not visibly. I photographed the label, closed the cabinet, and went to bed, my hands steadier than I expected them to be. The specific, practiced calm of someone who had already spent weeks quietly training herself not to react visibly to exactly this kind of moment. Because by that point, I already knew exactly what was happening to me, and I had already spent 3 weeks quietly building the case that would eventually prove it, in a courtroom, in front of a judge, with my stepbrother sitting 11 feet away from me, watching his own carefully constructed lie collapse in real time under the weight of something he never once suspected I'd been doing the entire time. Recording. Before I tell you what that recording actually contained, if you've ever had someone you trusted try to convince you, and everyone around you, that you couldn't trust your own mind, take a second and subscribe, but only if this actually means something to you. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and I promise you, I understand exactly how disorienting it is to start doubting your own memory because the people closest to you are working very hard, quietly and patiently, to make sure you do. Let me take you back to where this all started, because you can't understand what happened in that courtroom without understanding the 18 months that came before it, and the specific quiet dread that built inside me, week by week, long before I had any proof at all, and long before I even fully trusted my own growing sense that something in my life had quietly, deliberately gone wrong. I grew up in Sonoma County, California, the only child of my parents' marriage until I was 9, when my mother passed away suddenly from an aneurysm, an event that reshaped my entire childhood in ways I'm still, at 36, occasionally surprised to discover I haven't fully processed. My father, Edward Hale, remarried 4 years later to a polished, socially ambitious woman named Diane, who came into the marriage with a son from her previous relationship, my stepbrother Marcus, 2 years older than me. My father's family had, for 3 generations, owned and operated Hale Ridge Vineyard, a mid-sized, respected winery in the Sonoma Hills that produced, by the time I was an adult, roughly 40,000 cases annually and carried a reputation, within the regional wine industry, considerably larger than its actual production volume might suggest. I want to be honest from the beginning, that my relationship with Marcus and Diane was never openly hostile during my childhood or early adulthood. It was something quieter and, in retrospect, considerably more insidious than open hostility. A slow, patient positioning that I didn't fully recognize as strategic until years later, once I understood exactly what it had all been building toward. Diane, from the earliest days of the marriage, worked steadily to position Marcus as my father's natural successor at the vineyard, despite the fact that Marcus had no blood relationship to the Hale family legacy at all, encouraging my father to bring him into the business young, to teach him the operational and financial details of running the winery with the same care my father might once have reserved for a biological heir. I was encouraged by contrast toward what Diane described more than once as a life of your own, away from all this old family pressure. A framing that sounded, on its surface, generous and even protective, but that I came to understand much later, had actually functioned for years as a quiet, deliberate mechanism for keeping me at arm's length from the one asset that would eventually become the center of everything. I want to give you one specific memory from my early 20s that, looking back now, reads very differently than it did at the time, and that I've come to see as an early, quiet blueprint for everything that followed years later. I had come home from Davis for a summer break, genuinely excited to spend time in the vineyard, and I asked my father, half-jokingly, whether he might teach me some of the basic blending techniques he'd spent that particular summer teaching Marcus. Diane, overhearing the conversation from the kitchen, stepped in gently before my father could even fully answer and said, "Oh, sweetheart, don't worry about all that. You have your studies, your own beautiful path ahead of you. Let Marcus carry the heavy stuff." My father, to my quiet disappointment even then, deferred to her framing without much resistance, and I remember feeling, at the time, a small, hard-to-name discomfort I didn't yet have the vocabulary to identify as anything more than ordinary sibling dynamics. It would be nearly 15 years before I understood that comment as part of a much longer, much more deliberate pattern, rather than the isolated, well-meaning suggestion it had appeared to be in the moment. I did genuinely build a life of my own. I studied clinical psychology at UC Davis, went on to earn my license as a marriage and family therapist, and built, over the following decade, a well-regarded private practice in Santa Rosa specializing in trauma and grief work. A professional path I chose, I'll admit now with the benefit of hindsight, at least partly because of my own mother's sudden death when I was 9. A wound I spent years learning to understand clinically as a way of eventually understanding it personally. I want you to hold on to this detail carefully as this story unfolds, because it becomes significant in ways I never could have anticipated. I spent over a decade professionally trained, at an advanced clinical level, to recognize the precise psychological mechanics of manipulation, gaslighting, and coercive control. I had, without ever once imagining I would need it for my own life, built exactly the expertise required to notice, name, and eventually prove what was about to be done to me.
I want to describe briefly what that professional training actually looked like in practice, because I think it matters for understanding exactly how I was able to recognize the pattern once it began, long before I had any concrete proof to point to, back when it was still only a persistent, nagging unease I couldn't yet fully justify to myself, let alone to anyone else. Over the years, I had personally treated dozens of clients recovering from coercive control in various forms, controlling partners, manipulative business associates, in a small handful of cases, adult children being systematically undermined by aging parents seeking to control an inheritance. I had studied, in exhaustive clinical detail, the specific mechanics of how effective manipulation operates, not through single dramatic acts, which are easy to identify and resist, but through slow, cumulative, individually deniable incidents specifically designed to erode a target's confidence in her own perception over time until she becomes, functionally, easier to control or discredit. I had taught continuing education seminars on exactly this topic to other clinicians in the region. I understood, in other words, this precise phenomenon with a depth of expertise that very few people targeted by it are ever fortunate enough to possess going in. It would prove to be, in the end, the single most important asset I had. I want to pause here for a moment, because I know some of you are already sensing where this is heading, and I want to check in with you before we go further into the harder parts of a story. If you've ever had a family member position themselves for years, quietly, patiently, long before you ever understood what they were actually building toward, drop a comment with the word patient below. I want you to know I see you, and I understand exactly how unsettling it is, looking back, to realize how long a conspiracy against you had actually been in motion before you ever noticed the first sign of it. Now, back to the story, because my father's death is where the quiet, patient positioning of all those years finally began, sharply and deliberately, to move, and where the specific, targeted campaign against me eventually took a shape I could no longer explain away as ordinary grief, exhaustion, or coincidence, however much some quiet part of me still wanted, for a little while longer, to believe it might be exactly that. My father died 18 months ago, of a sudden stroke, at 67, while walking the Vineyard's East Block early one morning, a death that was, in every clinical sense, instant and painless, though the shock of it devastated me in ways I'm still, even now, learning to carry. In the immediate aftermath, grief consumed everything, exactly the way it consumes everyone, and I want to be honest that for the first several weeks, I registered almost nothing unusual in Diane's or Marcus's behavior beyond the ordinary, understandable strain of a family absorbing a sudden loss together. It was only later, looking back with the clinical training I'd spent over a decade building, that I began to recognize the earliest, most careful signs of something considerably more deliberate than grief. My father's will, read 3 weeks after his death, left Hale Ridge Vineyard, the land, the operating business, and a controlling trust holding the majority of the family's remaining assets, to me as his only biological child, with a provision naming Marcus as a continuing employee and minority stakeholder, but with ultimate decision-making authority resting entirely with me as trustee. I want to be clear about something, because I think it matters enormously to understanding what happened next. I did not intend to exclude Marcus from a meaningful, secure role in the business he genuinely helped build over 15 years of real, competent work. I told him so directly, within days of the will's reading, offering him an expanded operational role with real, substantial authority over day-to-day winemaking decisions, along with a formal profit-sharing structure considerably more generous than the will technically required. He accepted, at the time, with what appeared to be genuine gratitude. I believed, for the following 2 months, that we were building something workable together. The first sign that something else was happening entirely came roughly 6 weeks after my father's death, at a family dinner at Diane's house, when she mentioned, almost offhandedly over dessert, that she'd run into my old college roommate at a fundraiser and that the roommate had seemed a little worried about how I was holding up, given, Diane said, glancing at me with an expression I couldn't quite read at the time. Everything that happened back at Davis. I want to explain what that phrase meant because it becomes central to everything that follows. During my sophomore year at UC Davis at 19, in the raw, unprocessed wake of my mother's death a decade earlier finally catching up with me during an especially difficult academic term, I had gone through a genuinely difficult period involving alcohol misuse and a brief, voluntary stay at a university-affiliated counseling and wellness program, a period I had worked through with real clinical support and had been, for the following 17 years, completely and verifiably sober and stable, a fact documented extensively across my own professional licensing records, which require, as part of maintaining an active clinical license, ongoing disclosure and monitoring specifically designed to catch exactly this kind of relapse, if it ever occurred. I told Diane calmly that I appreciated her concern but that I was doing well, genuinely well, and that the period she was referencing was 17 years in my past. She smiled warmly and said, "Of course, sweetheart. I just worry about you carrying so much on your own now." I didn't think much more about that conversation that night. I want you to notice, though, because I certainly did later, exactly how precisely targeted that comment actually was. Not a general expression of concern, but a specific, deliberate reference to the one vulnerability in my entire adult history that could, if framed correctly to the right audience, be used to suggest instability. It was, I'd later understand, the opening move of a campaign that had clearly begun taking shape long before that dinner. Over the following 2 months, a pattern began to emerge that I want to describe to you carefully because each individual piece, taken alone, could plausibly be dismissed as coincidence, misunderstanding, or ordinary grief-related confusion, which is, I came to understand through my own clinical training, precisely the design of effective gaslighting. It works not through one dramatic, undeniable act, but through an accumulation of small, individually deniable incidents specifically engineered to make the target doubt her own perception of reality, while simultaneously, quietly, building a case in the eyes of everyone else that she's becoming unreliable. I began finding small things out of place in my own house. A set of keys I was certain I'd left in the kitchen bowl appearing instead in my coat pocket. A bottle of wine I distinctly remembered finishing appearing, 3/4 full, back in my refrigerator 2 days later. I mentioned this, once, carefully, to Marcus, during what I believed at the time was an innocent conversation about how exhausting grief could be, and he responded with a gentle, concerned tone that I now recognize, with painful clarity, as entirely rehearsed. "Vivi, you've been under so much stress. Are you sure you're sleeping enough? Sometimes when we're overwhelmed, we do things and just don't fully register them." I remember, in that specific moment, feeling a genuine flicker of doubt about my own memory, the exact, disorienting sensation that clinical literature on gaslighting describes with total precision, and I remember, too, the particular chill that ran through me a few days later when that same flicker of doubt made me realize, with sudden, sharpened clarity, exactly what kind of conversation I had just been in. I want to describe several more of these incidents in detail because I think the accumulation matters more than any single one could convey on its own, and because I think it's important for anyone watching who might be sitting inside their own version of this exact, disorienting uncertainty right now to understand just how ordinary, how individually forgettable, each piece can seem in isolation. About 5 weeks after my father's death, I woke one morning to find my home office door standing open. Though I distinctly remembered closing it the night before, a small habit left over from years of protecting confidential client files, even after I'd stopped seeing clients from home. Nothing appeared to be disturbed inside, and when I mentioned it, carefully, to Diane over the phone the next day, she laughed warmly and said, "Oh, sweetheart, I noticed that door open myself when I stopped by to drop off that casserole last week. I just assumed you'd left it that way on purpose. You've had so much on your mind." I hadn't been home when she claimed to have dropped off any casserole. a detail I confirmed later by checking my own calendar, and a doorbell camera recording I'd forgotten I still had active from a period years earlier, when my father had insisted on installing one after a string of neighborhood break-ins. The footage showed no delivery, no visit, nothing at all during the window Diane had described. I didn't confront her about it. I simply wrote the date and the discrepancy down on an index card I'd started keeping in my nightstand drawer, the earliest, unformed version of what would eventually become the legal pad. A week after that, I received a calendar invitation, appearing suddenly in my professional scheduling software, for a medical appointment I had no memory of booking, with a physician whose name I didn't recognize, scheduled for a date I would later realize corresponded closely to when the falsified prescription would eventually be called in. I called the office listed on the invitation, and a receptionist confirmed, politely, that yes, an appointment had been scheduled under my name, by phone, though she couldn't specify who had actually placed the call. I canceled it, quietly, without mentioning it to anyone in my family, and added it, with a growing, uneasy clarity, to my index cards. I want to pause here because I know this next section moves into genuinely unsettling territory, and I want to check in with you before we go further. If you've ever had that exact, specific experience, mentioning something confusing to someone you trusted, only to have their gentle concern somehow make you doubt your own memory instead of validating your confusion, drop a comment with the word "flicker" below. I understand precisely how disorienting that particular moment can be, and I want you to know that noticing it, the way I eventually did, is itself a form of strength, even when it doesn't feel like one in the moment. Now, back to the story, because that specific realization, the moment I understood I might be looking at a deliberate pattern rather than a series of coincidences, is where everything about how I handled the following year actually changed. I want to be honest about the exact moment my clinical training took over from my grief and my fear. It happened on a Tuesday evening, about 10 weeks after my father's death, sitting alone in my kitchen with a legal pad, forcing myself to write down, chronologically, every single incident I could remember from the previous 2 months. The keys, the wine bottle, 3 separate instances of appointments I was certain I'd never scheduled appearing on my calendar. A conversation with my father's longtime attorney that Marcus later insisted, gently but firmly, had never taken place exactly the way I remembered it. Laid out together, chronologically, on that legal pad, the pattern was unmistakable to me in a way it had never been while I was experiencing each incident individually, isolated by weeks of ordinary grief and exhaustion in between. I remember sitting at that table until nearly 2 a.m, reading and rereading my own handwriting, half expecting, even then, to find some innocent explanation that would collapse the whole pattern back into ordinary coincidence, the specific way you sometimes hope, even after you've started to suspect something serious, that you'll be proven wrong simply because being wrong would be so much easier to live with. I didn't find that innocent explanation. What I found instead, reading my own careful documentation back to myself in the quiet of that kitchen, was a growing, cold certainty that felt almost like a physical weight settling into my chest, the specific, unmistakable recognition of a professional pattern I had spent a decade learning to identify in other people's lives, now sitting, undeniably, inside my own. I recognized, with the specific, clinical clarity of someone who had spent a decade studying exactly this phenomenon in other people's lives, that I was looking at a textbook pattern of engineered gaslighting, and that whoever was doing it to me was being patient, careful, and disturbingly sophisticated about it. I made a decision that night that shaped everything that followed. I decided not to confront anyone directly, not yet, and not to let anyone in my family know that I had noticed the pattern at all. I want to explain my reasoning, because I know some of you might wonder why I didn't simply raise the alarm immediately. My clinical training told me something important about how these situations typically unfold when the target confronts too early without evidence. The person or people responsible almost always pivot immediately into an even more sophisticated version of the same manipulation, framing the confrontation itself as further proof of instability. See, she's become paranoid. She's accusing us of things that never happened. This is exactly the kind of erratic behavior we were worried about. I understood clearly that if I raised the alarm without proof, I would hand whoever was doing this exactly the evidence they needed to make their case stronger, not weaker. So instead, the following week, I did something that still, looking back, feels like the single most important decision of this entire ordeal. I contacted a private investigator, a careful, discreet former financial crimes detective named Rosa Delgado, who had been recommended to me years earlier by a therapy client going through an unrelated custody dispute, and I hired her, quietly, using a separate bank account and a private email address unconnected to anything my family had access to begin documenting everything. My own daily movements and calendar, cross-referenced against anything unusual that occurred in my home or my professional life, along with a careful, legal investigation into who else might have access to my house, my medical records, and my calendar. I want to describe the first meeting with Rosa in more detail because I think it captures the specific tone this entire investigation took from the very beginning. We met at a quiet coffee shop 2 towns away from Sonoma, deliberately outside any circle where I might run into someone who knew my family, and I remember feeling almost embarrassed, laying out my index cards on the small table between us, half expecting her to tell me, gently, that I was overreacting to ordinary grief-related confusion. Instead, she listened for nearly an hour without interrupting, asked a series of careful, precise questions about dates, access, and specific details I hadn't thought to record, and then said something that I've held onto ever since. In my experience, Ms. Hale, people who are actually losing touch with reality don't build this kind of careful, chronological documentation of their own uncertainty. That instinct alone tells me something important about what we're likely dealing with here. I remember the specific relief of hearing a trained, external professional validate the pattern I'd started to see, relief tangled together with a fresh, sharpened fear now that I understood I wasn't imagining any of it. I want to pause here because I know some of you are wondering how exactly this investigation began to unfold, and I promise we're getting there. But I want you to sit with this decision for a moment first, because I think it's the actual turning point of this entire story, more than anything that happened later in that courtroom. If you've ever had to make the difficult, lonely decision to quietly document a pattern instead of confronting it immediately, trusting that patience would eventually serve you better than an early, unsupported accusation, comment, quiet documentation below. I understand exactly how much discipline that particular kind of patience requires, especially while you're still actively grieving something else entirely. Now, back to the story, because the following 10 months are where the full shape of the conspiracy against me finally became clear, piece by careful piece, each new discovery landing with its own particular, cold weight as Rosa's investigation slowly, methodically confirmed what I had already begun to suspect on my own. Rosa's investigation, over those months, uncovered a genuinely disturbing structure behind what I'd been experiencing. She discovered, through careful, legal financial tracing, that Marcus had, approximately 4 months before my father's death, opened a private consultation with an estate attorney specializing in guardianship and conservatorship proceedings, well before my father's stroke, a detail that took my breath away when Rosa first showed it to me, because it meant the groundwork for challenging my competency had begun before my father had even died, built on the assumption, apparently, that his death was either anticipated or, more unsettlingly, that some version of this plan had existed regardless of when my father eventually passed. I want to describe the specific evening Rosa first walked me through her preliminary findings, because it's one of the more difficult memories from this entire ordeal. We met at her small, unmarked office above a hardware store in downtown Santa Rosa, and she laid out, methodically, a timeline she'd built entirely from public records, financial disclosures, and careful, legal surveillance of who had accessed my house and when. She showed me a printout of a visitor log from my own home security system, one I hadn't thought to review carefully myself in the fog of those early months, cross-referenced against Marcus's cell phone location data, obtained legally through a subpoena Catherine's office would later formalize, showing a pattern of brief, unexplained visits to my property during hours I was reliably at my office seeing clients, hours he would have known, from years of familiarity with my schedule, that I'd be reliably absent. She discovered that Diane had, over the preceding year, cultivated a quiet, seemingly casual friendship with a psychiatrist named Dr. Alan Voss, a man whose practice, Rosa's research revealed, had a documented history of providing favorable competency evaluations in several prior contested guardianship cases, evaluations that had subsequently been challenged, though never fully discredited, by opposing counsel in at least 2 of those cases. Rosa had traced this relationship back through a shared country club membership and a series of small, seemingly social donations Diane had made to a charity gala Dr. Voss chaired annually, donations that, individually meant nothing but that, laid out across an 18-month timeline alongside everything else, formed exactly the kind of patient, deliberate relationship cultivation Rosa told me she'd seen before in her years investigating financial crimes involving elder exploitation and contested estates. The pill bottle I opened the story with, the one prescribed by a doctor I had never met, turned out to be the specific piece that finally gave Rosa the traceable evidence she needed. She discovered, through a carefully executed records request once we had enough probable cause to justify it legally, that the prescription had been called into a pharmacy using a spoofed phone number designed to appear as though it originated from a legitimate medical office, and that the actual physical pill bottle, containing a mild anti-anxiety medication rather than anything more alarming, had most likely been placed in my medicine cabinet during a period when Marcus had visited my house, at my own invitation, to help me sort through some of my father's remaining personal effects, a visit I had, in the ordinary innocence of grief, never once thought to question at the time. I want to describe, honestly, what it felt like to receive Rosa's full report, roughly 7 months into her investigation, the complete, documented shape of everything that had been done to me laid out in careful, evidence-based detail across nearly 90 pages. It was not, I want to be clear, a moment of triumph. It was something far heavier, a specific, devastating grief entirely separate from the grief I still carried over my father's death, the grief of understanding, with total, undeniable clarity, that people I had trusted for over 2 decades had spent months deliberately, systematically working to convince me, and everyone around me, that I could not trust my own mind, in service of taking control of a legacy that had never legally belonged to them. Let me pause the story here for a moment because I know this is a lot to sit with, and I want to check in with you before we move into the final part of the story. If you've ever discovered, with total, documented certainty, exactly how deliberately someone you trusted had been working against you, drop a comment with the word "documented" below. I understand exactly how strange that particular kind of vindication feels. The relief of finally having proof, tangled together with a grief that proof alone can never fully resolve, and a quiet, lingering unease that never entirely disappears, no matter how thoroughly the evidence eventually vindicates you. Now, back to the story, because the final several months, leading up to the courtroom, are where everything I'd quietly built finally had to face its actual test. Marcus filed his formal petition roughly 9 months after my father's death, requesting that the probate court appoint a conservator over Hale Ridge Vineyards Trust, citing, in the petition itself, significant and escalating concerns about the trustee's mental stability and capacity to manage complex assets, supported by a formal evaluation from Dr. Voss, along with a supporting affidavit from Diane describing, in careful, clinical-sounding language clearly crafted with legal guidance, a pattern of erratic behavior, memory lapses, and paranoid accusations she claimed to have observed over the preceding several months. I want to be honest about how it felt to actually read that petition, served to me formally by a process server at my own front door on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. The specific, cold shock of seeing my own family's fabricated version of my mental state laid out in formal legal language, prepared to be presented to a judge as though it were simply, straightforwardly true. I remember standing on my own porch afterward, petition still in hand, watching the process server's car pull slowly away down the long gravel driveway my father had graded himself decades earlier, and feeling, for just a moment, the specific vertigo of realizing that a legal document now existed, filed with a real court, describing a version of me that bore almost no resemblance to the woman actually standing there reading it in the late afternoon light. I retained an attorney at that point, a sharp, formidable litigator named Catherine Reyes, who specialized specifically in contested guardianship and conservatorship defense, and together, we prepared a response that relied entirely on Rosa's documented investigation, The financial records showing Marcus's early consultation with guardianship counsel, the traced pharmacy call, the cultivated relationship with Dr. Voss, along with something Rosa had obtained in the final, critical weeks of her investigation, something I want to describe to you carefully because it becomes the actual turning point of the entire courtroom hearing that followed. About 6 weeks before my father's death, well before any of this campaign had visibly begun, Rosa, working from a legitimate tip developed through her financial tracing, had identified and interviewed a former housekeeper Diane had briefly employed and then dismissed under circumstances the housekeeper described, credibly and in detail, as retaliation for having witnessed something she wasn't supposed to see. That housekeeper, a careful, precise woman named Elena Reyes-Ortiz, no relation to my attorney, testified, in a sworn deposition Catherine's office arranged, that she had personally witnessed Diane and Marcus on 2 separate occasions in the weeks following my father's stroke, discussing, in explicit and deliberate terms, how to build a paper trail and how to make it look believable enough for a judge. Conversations Elena had found disturbing enough that she'd begun, on her own initiative, taking careful contemporaneous notes with dates and approximate quotes, notes she still possessed and was willing to produce. I want to pause here because I know this is the moment you've been waiting for, and I want to describe what happened next honestly rather than dramatically, because the truth of that courtroom was quieter and more procedurally devastating than anything a scripted confrontation could have been. If you've ever built a case in complete silence, letting people believe you were exactly as confused and unstable as they wanted you to seem, while quietly assembling proof that would eventually make that entire narrative collapse, comment built-in silence below. I promise you, I understand exactly what that particular discipline costs and exactly how satisfying it eventually feels to finally set it down. Now, back to the story, because the hearing itself, held 8 months ago in a modest, wood-panel courtroom in Santa Rosa, is the part one still think about most vividly, even now. I sat at the defense table with Catherine, dressed simply, deliberately unremarkable, in a plain gray suit, while Marcus, Diane, and their attorney, a polished, confident litigator named Gregory Pham, sat at the opposing table, radiating the particular, comfortable confidence of people who genuinely believed they had already won. Dr. Voss testified first, describing, at length and with considerable clinical-sounding authority, a competency evaluation that concluded, based largely on second-hand reports from Diane and Marcus rather than any direct, extended clinical observation of me, that I displayed concerning indicators of instability inconsistent with sound trustee judgment. I watched him testify with the specific, professional detachment my own clinical training allowed me to maintain, cataloging, silently, every procedural shortcut and methodological weakness in his evaluation that Catherine would systematically dismantle during cross-examination. Catherine's cross-examination of Dr. Voss took nearly 2 hours, and I want to describe one specific exchange, because it's the moment I watched his composure genuinely begin to fracture. She asked him, directly, how many hours of direct clinical observation he had personally conducted with me before reaching his conclusions. He answered after a long pause, approximately 90 minutes, across 2 sessions. She asked him whether standard clinical practice for a formal competency evaluation of this magnitude typically required considerably more extensive direct observation. He acknowledged, reluctantly, that it generally did. She then asked him, and I want you to sit with this question the way the entire courtroom did, whether he was aware that he had provided similarly favorable, expedited competency evaluations in at least 2 prior contested guardianship cases referred to him through the same estate attorney Marcus had consulted months before my father's death. His attorney objected immediately, and the judge, a measured, unhurried woman named Judge Okonkwo, who had clearly presided over a great many contested guardianship disputes considerably uglier than this one, allowed the question over that objection, noting, for the record, that pattern evidence regarding an expert witness's prior conduct was directly relevant to assessing the credibility of his current testimony. I want to describe one more moment from that particular cross-examination, because it's the detail I still think about most vividly. Catherine asked Dr. Voss to walk the court through the specific clinical basis for one line in his written evaluation, a sentence describing me as exhibiting paranoid ideation regarding household objects. He explained, somewhat uncomfortably, that this conclusion was based entirely on secondhand reports from Diane and Marcus describing my concerns about missing or misplaced items, rather than any direct clinical observation of paranoid symptoms during our actual sessions together. Catherine asked, evenly, whether it would change his clinical assessment to learn that at least 3 of those specific incidents had since been independently documented through security footage and financial records as deliberately staged. I watched him sit with that question for a long, uncomfortable silence before answering, quietly, that it would indeed change his assessment considerably. It was, I believe, the single moment the entire courtroom understood exactly how thin his evaluation's actual foundation had been. Marcus testified next, and I want to describe honestly what it felt like watching him, someone I had genuinely believed for years was something close to a real brother, describe a version of my behavior over the preceding several months that bore almost no resemblance to anything I had actually said or done, delivered with a practiced, sorrowful sincerity that I recognized, with clinical precision, as an extremely well-rehearsed performance. Catherine's cross-examination of Marcus began gently, almost conversationally, walking him carefully through the general timeline of his concerns, before pivoting, with a precision I'd watched her prepare for weeks, into the specific financial records Rosa had uncovered. "Mr. Hale," she said, "can you explain to the court why you consulted a guardianship and conservatorship attorney 4 months before your stepfather's death, at a time when, by your own account, you had no concerns whatsoever about Ms. Hale's mental stability?" I watched Marcus's face in that exact moment, and I want to describe it as precisely as I can, because I've replayed it many times since. A specific, visible drain of color, the particular expression of a man realizing, in real time, that a detail he had genuinely believed was buried too deep in an unrelated attorney's private records to ever surface had just been placed, cleanly and irrefutably, into the official court record. He tried, briefly, to explain the consultation away as unrelated general estate planning, a claim Catherine dismantled within minutes by introducing the attorney's own billing records, which described the specific nature of the consultation in explicit, unambiguous terms directly related to contesting trustee competency. She followed that with a second, quieter question that I believe did even more damage than the first. "Mr. Hale, isn't it true that you personally visited Ms. Hale's home on 4 separate occasions during hours you knew she would be at her office, according to her security system's visitor log, which we've entered into evidence as Exhibit 14? Marcus's attorney objected on relevance grounds, and Judge Okonkwo, again, allowed the question, noting dryly that a pattern of unexplained access to the alleged victim's home during her confirmed absence seemed, to the court, directly relevant to a case built substantially on claims about items mysteriously appearing and disappearing inside that same home. Marcus's answer, when it finally came, was a quiet, halting admission that he had, in fact, visited during those windows, though he claimed, unconvincingly, that each visit had an innocent explanation. He struggled, under further questioning, to specify with any real consistency. Gregory Pham, watching his own client's testimony collapse under documented evidence he had apparently never been shown in full, requested a brief recess, and I watched, across the courtroom, a hurried, tense conversation unfold between him, Marcus, and Diane, the particular body language of people realizing, all at once, that the version of events they'd built their entire case around had just become considerably less defensible than they'd believed it to be. Let me pause here one more time because I know some of you are wondering how the rest of that hearing actually resolved, and I promise we're getting there. But I want you to sit with this moment first. If you've ever watched someone's carefully constructed lie collapse, piece by piece, under the weight of evidence they never once suspected you'd already gathered, comment collapse below. I understand exactly how complicated that particular kind of vindication feels. Not quite triumph, not quite relief, but something adjacent to both. The specific, layered feeling of watching months of careful, silent work finally, publicly justify itself in front of the one audience that actually had the power to change anything. Now, back to the story, because the final piece of evidence, introduced after the recess, is the part that ultimately ended any real chance of Marcus's petition succeeding. Catherine called Elena Reyes-Ortiz to testify next, and I watched Diane's composure, which had remained relatively steady through Marcus's difficult cross-examination, genuinely fracture for the first time, as Elena described, calmly and in careful, specific detail, the conversation she'd overheard between Diane and Marcus in the weeks following my father's stroke, the explicit discussion of building a paper trail, of finding a psychiatrist who would provide a favorable evaluation without excessive scrutiny, of specific strategies for making the pattern look believable enough for a judge. Elena produced her contemporaneous notes, dated and detailed, which Catherine had already had independently authenticated by a forensic document examiner in the weeks leading up to the hearing. I want to describe Elena's testimony in a bit more detail because I think her specific words deserve to be part of the story. She explained, in clear, unhurried English carrying a slight accent she'd never lost from her childhood in Oaxaca, that she had worked for Diane for just over 4 months before being abruptly dismissed, 2 weeks after my father's stroke, with a severance payment she found unusually generous for such a short tenure. A detail Catherine noted pointedly for the court as consistent with a deliberate effort to secure her silence rather than an ordinary employment decision. Elena testified that she had overheard the specific conversation in question while cleaning an adjoining room, half-open door, Diane's voice pitched low but clearly audible, describing to Marcus a need to make sure the paper trail looks organic, not planned, and Marcus responding with a comment about needing a few more weeks before the pattern looks convincing enough. Elena testified that she had found the conversation disturbing enough, given the recent, sudden loss of my father, that she had gone home that same night and written down everything she could remember, with dates, understanding even then, she said, that she might never have reason to use those notes, but feeling, in her words, that someone should know, in case it ever mattered. Gregory Pham's cross-examination of Elena was, by comparison to everything that had come before it, brief and largely unsuccessful, unable to meaningfully challenge either her credibility or the specific, dated documentation supporting her account. He attempted, at one point, to suggest that her unusually generous severance payment indicated a financial motive to fabricate her testimony now, a suggestion Elena addressed with a calm, unwavering directness that I found genuinely moving to witness. I did not need to invent anything, she said. I only needed to remember what I already heard, and write it down before I could talk myself out of believing it mattered. Judge Okonkwo, reviewing all of this evidence together, did not take long to reach her decision. She denied Marcus's petition in full, finding that the evidence presented failed entirely to establish any genuine basis for questioning my competency as trustee, and noted, further, for the formal record, that the pattern of evidence uncovered during the proceeding, the early guardianship consultation, the traced pharmaceutical fraud, the cultivated psychiatric relationship, and the sworn testimony regarding explicit discussions of manufacturing a false narrative, raised sufficiently serious concerns that she was formally referring the matter to the County District Attorney's Office for review of potential elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy charges, given the deliberate targeting of a vulnerable trust following a parent's death. I want to be honest about what I felt, sitting at that defense table, listening to that ruling. It wasn't quite triumph, though there was relief in it, real and significant. It was something heavier and more complicated, the particular grief of watching a courtroom formally, officially confirm what I had already known for months, that people I had once genuinely loved and trusted had spent nearly a year of my grief deliberately, systematically working to convince the world I couldn't trust my own mind, in service of taking something that had never legally belonged to them. I remember, specifically, the strange, disorienting sensation of hearing Judge Okonkwo's words land, one by one, in a courtroom gone almost completely silent, and feeling, underneath the relief, a kind of exhaustion, so total it took several days afterward for my body to fully register that the fight, at least this particular one, was actually over. I want to tell you honestly what happened in the months that followed, because I think it matters more than the courtroom victory itself, more, even, than the specific relief of hearing a judge formally, officially side with the truth after nearly a year of watching that truth get quietly, deliberately buried. The district attorney's office did ultimately file charges against Marcus and Diane, and the criminal case, still ongoing as I record this, has proceeded largely on the strength of the same documented evidence Rosa and Catherine assembled for the civil proceeding. Dr. Voss, facing his own scrutiny from the state medical board following the pattern evidence introduced at my hearing, voluntarily surrendered his license rather than face a formal disciplinary hearing, a resolution I've chosen to view as its own quiet form of accountability, even without a full criminal reckoning attached to his specific conduct. I want to describe one specific moment from the weeks immediately following the hearing because I think it captures something important about how genuine relief actually settles, as opposed to the clean, immediate version we sometimes expect from stories like this. About 10 days after Judge Okonkwo's ruling, I drove out to the east block of the vineyard alone, early in the morning, the same section where my father had died, and I sat there for nearly 2 hours, not crying exactly, just sitting, letting the full weight of the preceding year finally settle into something I could actually feel rather than simply manage. I remember thinking, specifically, about the index cards in my nightstand drawer, the ones I'd started keeping before I even had a name for what was happening to me, and feeling a strange, quiet gratitude toward the version of myself who had trusted her own careful observation even while everyone around her was actively working to convince her not to. I have not spoken to Marcus or Diane since the hearing, and I want to be honest that I don't know, even now, whether I ever will again. I've had to sit with real, complicated grief about that distance, separate from the grief I still carry over my father's death. The grief of losing not just a stepbrother and stepmother, but the entire, extended version of family I'd built my adult life around, even knowing, with total clarity, that the version of that family, who might have deserved my continued presence in their lives, had never actually existed the way I'd once believed it did. I think, sometimes, about the specific version of Marcus I remember from childhood, the one who once helped me build an elaborate blanket fort during a particularly difficult week after my mother's death, patient and genuinely kind in a way that felt, at the time, entirely uncomplicated. I don't know exactly when that version of him gave way to the man who spent months quietly working to have me declared unfit, and I've had to make peace with the fact that I may never fully understand that particular transformation, or whether it was even a transformation at all, rather than something that had always existed alongside the kindness, waiting patiently for the right circumstances to finally reveal itself. I want to tell you about my own healing process too, because I think it belongs in this story as much as the courtroom drama does. I returned to my own therapy with a colleague I trust deeply, working specifically through the particular, layered trauma of having my own professional expertise, the exact clinical training I'd built my entire career around, weaponized against me by people who understood precisely which vulnerability to target. I want to be honest that even now, months later, I sometimes catch myself double-checking small things. Whether I actually locked a door, whether I actually remembered a conversation correctly, a lingering, residual echo of months spent deliberately having my own perception undermined. I've learned, through my own clinical work with other survivors of exactly this kind of manipulation, that this particular echo is common, and that it fades, slowly, with time and continued evidence that your own perception can, in fact, be trusted. I've also found, somewhat unexpectedly, that this entire ordeal has changed the way I practice clinically with my own clients who come to me describing situations that sound, even faintly, like what I lived through. I no longer simply validate their confusion in the general, professionally appropriate way I was trained to years ago. I recognize it now, viscerally, in a way textbooks alone never fully taught me, and I believe, though I can't prove this the way Rosa proved her case, that my clients can feel the difference. The difference between a therapist who understands gaslighting clinically and one who understands it because she once sat at her own kitchen table at 2 a.m, forcing herself to trust a legal pad over a chorus of gentle, rehearsed voices insisting she couldn't trust herself at all. Hale Ridge Vineyard continues operating, under my full trusteeship, with a new operations leadership structure I've built carefully over the past 8 months, and I've found, in that rebuilding work, something genuinely meaningful, not triumph over Marcus specifically, but a real, hard-won sense of stewardship over the legacy my father actually wanted me to protect. I planted, this past spring, a new small block of vines along the East Ridge, near the exact spot where my father died, a quiet, private memorial that means more to me than any public gesture ever could. I want to describe that planting day because it's become, for me, one of the more meaningful images to hold onto from this entire year. I did it alone, early on a Saturday morning, no ceremony, no announcement to anyone, Just me, a small crew of 2 longtime vineyard workers who had known my father for over 20 years, and several dozen young vine cuttings we settled carefully into the same soil he'd walked across the morning he died. One of the workers, an older man named Tomas who had worked the vineyard since before I was born, told me, quietly as we finished, that he'd always believed the East Block held something worth protecting long before any of this legal drama began, and that he was glad, in his words, to see the right Hale finally holding it. I didn't say much in response. I simply nodded and kept working and let that particular, unglamorous Saturday morning become its own quiet form of closure, entirely separate from anything that had happened in that courtroom. I keep, in my office at the vineyard, a framed copy of Rose's original 90-page investigative report, not displayed prominently but kept close, in a drawer I open only occasionally, a private reminder of exactly how much quiet, patient documentation it took to protect a truth that people I trusted worked very hard to bury. I think, often, about that legal pad from the kitchen table, the one where I first wrote everything down chronologically and finally saw the pattern for what it actually was. I think about how close I came in those early weeks to simply accepting the doubt they were trying to plant in me, the way gaslighting is specifically designed to make you do. I want to describe one more image that has stayed with me because I think it captures something essential about the entire ordeal better than any single dramatic moment could. A few weeks after the hearing, going through some of my father's old files that I still hadn't fully sorted, I found a small, handwritten note he'd apparently kept for years, tucked inside a folder of vineyard records, dated from shortly after Diane and Marcus had first moved into our lives. It read, simply, in his familiar, slightly slanted handwriting, "Vivi asked about blending today. D. said let her have her own path. Should have said yes." I don't know exactly why he kept that note for over 2 decades, or whether he ever fully understood, before his death, the deeper pattern it was quietly documenting. But I've chosen to believe that some part of him always sensed something was slightly off, even if he never found the words, or the courage, to fully name it while he was alive. I keep that note now, folded carefully, in the same drawer as Rose's report, 2 small pieces of evidence, separated by 20 years, that together tell the fuller story of everything that led to that courtroom. I want to leave you with one final thought because I think it matters more than any single detail of the hearing itself. For nearly a year, I let the people closest to me believe I hadn't noticed anything at all, and I want to be honest that there were nights during that period when the manufactured doubt nearly won anyway, when I lay awake genuinely uncertain whether I was building a careful, evidence-based case, or simply constructing an elaborate story to explain away my own confusion. What got me through wasn't certainty that I'd eventually be vindicated in a courtroom. I had no way of knowing, for most of that year, that vindication was even a realistic possibility. What got me through was trusting the specific, professional discipline I'd spent a decade building, one index card at a time, one carefully documented discrepancy at a time, and refusing to let anyone convince me that my own careful observation was itself evidence of instability. I think that's the part of this whole experience I'd most want anyone watching, sitting in their own version of that uncertainty right now, to actually take with them. If you take one thing from this story, let it be this. The people who work hardest to convince you that you can't trust your own mind are very often the people who understand, with disturbing precision, exactly how much you actually do know. Manufactured doubt is not evidence of instability. It is very often exactly the opposite, proof that someone believes your clarity is dangerous enough to them that it needs to be systematically undermined before it can be used against them. I spent nearly a year being deliberately gaslit by people who had spent years patiently positioning themselves for exactly this moment. What saved me wasn't confronting them loudly or trusting my instincts alone, unsupported. It was slowing down, documenting everything with the same careful, evidence-based discipline I'd spent a decade building professionally, and trusting that a patient, quiet case, built correctly, would eventually withstand scrutiny in a way that panic and accusation never could have, no matter how frightened or isolated I felt in the months before anyone else finally saw what I had already documented. You don't need to raise your voice to prove a manufactured lie is a lie. Sometimes the truest kind of vindication isn't about confronting the people trying to convince you you're unstable. It's about the quiet, patient months before that confrontation, when you kept your own counsel, documented everything carefully, and trusted that the truth, built correctly, would eventually be strong enough to stand entirely on its own in the one room where it actually mattered. Thank you for staying with me through this one, all the way to the end. If any part of this reminded you of your own experience with manufactured doubt, or your own quiet months of documenting something nobody else could yet see, or your own kitchen table at 2 in the morning trying to decide whether to trust your own memory, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, about gaslighting, about quiet vigilance, about the specific, suspenseful kind of justice that finally arrives when patient documentation meets a courtroom that actually looks closely, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and I'll see you in the next one.